Hello, welcome to NEWS.am. I'm Alexandrian. Joining me today is Christina Arakelian, fellow of the Armenian Society of Fellows from the US. Ms. Arakelian, thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like us to start with the US's new administration's involvement in the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict resolution negotiations. There haven't actually been many announcements from the US regarding the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, but recently Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff briefly mentioned the conflict, stating that it would not be appropriate for the US to mediate if it cannot have a significant impact. He emphasized that the US should only participate in negotiations where it can make a real difference. How should we interpret this statement?
Well, I think it needs to be interpreted in terms of the overall philosophy of the Trump administration, which is US first, right? So what Witkoff is basically saying is very straightforward and understandable, which is, why do we want to risk U.S. prestige, U.S. involvement in something where we're not going to have an impact? Now, if I were to counter Witkoff, I would say something that perhaps has not been considered by the administration, which is, yes, it is important for the U.S. to only be engaged in things where it can have a strategic impact. But it also is important to be engaged in areas where, candidly, it's core to the strategic interest of the United States. At this moment, Armenia has not really made the case to the United States on why Armenia is important to U.S. Foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia and China. At the moment, it's pretty well understood that the Trump administration is looking to effectuate what, in essence, people are calling a reverse Kissinger strategy. So let's start with the Kissinger strategy, which is pivot to China, right? At this moment, people are saying, let's pivot to Russia to weaken China. Okay, so the question is how can Armenia be an important component of that? Azerbaijan and Turkey are aligned with China. China is also taking a decisive role in Georgia, meaning Armenia has not really made the case. So this is something, candidly, that the Armenian government needs to counter and engage with the administration on, but to date, they've not really made the case. And let me just say one thing, too. The DNC, Congo, effectively, has made a proposal to the United States government to take a look and see if there can be a deal on rare earth elements. To my knowledge, the Armenian government has not made any type of offer similar to this to the U.S. government to take a look strategically at SUNIC and how they can work together in rare earth elements in Armenia proper, as well as facilitating access to rare earth elements from Central Asia for both European countries as well as the U.S. So these are important components to frame out what Witkoff is saying. Witkoff is going based on what he knows. Okay, I would suspect that Witkoff has not been fully briefed on Armenia, has not been fully briefed on the significance of SUNIC and rare earth elements, of how Armenia basically can unlock a lot of this potential and bring a balance of power in that region. So if Witkoff is not appropriately briefed with the administration, then of course he's going to go on what he knows versus a more holistic analysis.
Is this the only reason? How much does the Trump administration prioritize this region, the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict?
At the moment, in candor, I don't think they prioritize it at all. And I'm just speaking very honestly. At the end of the day, it's basically, at the moment, viewed as a rounding error, okay? The administration is entirely focused on, number one, resolving the conflict in Ukraine, and number two, resolving the conflict in the Middle East. There's two components of that, one of which relates to the Palestinian issue in Gaza and the West Bank, and the other of which is Iran, right? So the key thing is not for Armenia as such to say, okay, I'm gonna be a higher priority than those priorities. That's not going to happen. The key thing is to say, how does Armenia fit into those existing priorities? And how can Armenia then make the case that engaging with Armenia will in turn facilitate those priorities for the United States? So for example, when I said before that the US administration is pursuing what in effect is a reverse Kissinger policy, right? Pivoting to Russia to weaken China. Well, Armenia sits right in the middle of that. The administration is also looking for opportunities to have dialogue with Iran. It was reported in the media yesterday that Putin actually offered to the United States government to broker talks with Iran. This is going to be important to bring balance to Israel's more sort of aggressive posture towards Iran. And what they're clearly gunning for is to involve the US in a war with Iran. Why is that proffer coming from Russia as opposed to Armenia? You see, there's definitely opportunities on the table for Armenia to reframe the debate. It's a question of seizing the opportunity and making the case.
Are you saying that Armenia can take the role of a mediator?
I've always said that. Now, it doesn't mean to say, I just want to be careful in terms of how people are interpreting what I'm saying. Do Armenians have the current capacity to play that role? Yes. Does the Pashinyan administration have the ability to do that? No. They've not proven any capability to implement any sophisticated diplomatic strategies whatsoever.
Overall, this shift in policy towards Russia, how can this affect Armenia?
I actually think it's a very positive development for Armenia because at the end of the day, Russia is Armenia's main trading partner, okay? And Armenia has very strong historic ties with Russia. So I think it's an opportunity for Armenia to work in a positive way with both the United States and Russia. Now, the key thing right now, though, is that Pashinyan is really orienting himself towards what I call sort of the mainline establishment EU countries, all right, like France and Germany, versus the United States, because now there's a split in the West, okay, in terms of the position on Russia. So when Pashinyan is basically taking a referendum saying, should Armenia be part of the EU? Okay, well, that is not aligned with US strategy. Do you see what I'm saying? Like the rhetoric in Armenia has to shift. It has to shift from Armenia is pivoting to the West versus is Armenia going to go in the direction of the US or is Armenia going to go in the direction of the EU and Brussels? Because those are two totally different types of pivots to the West. And at the moment, they're not aligned. And there's nothing that Armenia can do to basically reconcile those two positions at this point, right? So the thing is does the Pashinyan administration even recognize or understand that the rhetoric of pivoting to the West as such no longer makes sense, given that there is a split in the West in terms of relations with Russia on a going forward basis? But it would be foolish. It would be foolish for Armenia not to take advantage of it. I think the difficulty is that, candidly, Pashinyan has no real credentials or credibility with the Trump administration.
And there are opinions that after this policy change by Trump administration, will need to expect expansion of Russian influence in this region. What do you think about this?
Do I think that the Trump policies will expand Russia influence in the South Caucasus?
Yeah.
Well, for sure. Because for one thing, I think it is well recognized that Russia's lack of attention to the South Caucasus was predicated upon their focus in Ukraine, right? So insofar as the focus in Ukraine is not all-consuming, by definition, it's going to allow Russia to expand its influence in the South Caucasus. And I think that it's reported that Mirzoyan, has had several calls with Lavrov over the past month or two, and Pashinyan and Putin are speaking with one another. I think that this is a reflection of the fact that they recognize that they're going to have to be on pretty good terms with Russia on a going forward basis. I would say this, though, which is not really being discussed, I think, in the administration, but should be. The fact of the matter is that what the U.S. needs to do in the South Caucasus is create a balance of power between Russia and Turkish interests. Okay, at the moment, it is not doing this, and so the fact of the matter is that if Azerbaijan and Turkey control the crossroads of peace or the Zangezur corridor, however you want, whatever terminology you feel like using, the fact of the matter is that is inimical to both Russian and Iranian interest. Okay, and that means basically that that the U.S. is not a neutral actor anymore. The U.S. is actually taking sides, and then you have to ask yourself, okay, if the objective of the U.S. government is to create sort of a fissure between Russia and China, how is it possible, okay, for that to take place when Turkish, Azeri, and Chinese interests are consolidating in the region with Georgia's cooperation? You see, this hasn't really been well thought through by the administration. And again, I think it's because, by and large, the South Caucasus and that region has been seen as an afterthought versus a strategic consideration.
You just mentioned crossroads of peace and Zangezur corridor. Zangezur corridor being actually used by Azerbaijanis, and crossroads of peace being a project that the Armenian government is trying to implement. Why do you think they kind of align with each other?
To be honest, Zangezur corridor is the terminology that is most frequently used outside of Armenia. Very few people use the terminology of crossroads of peace, mostly because it is, it doesn't really tell you what it is. Like the Azeri objectives with the Zangezur corridor is very clear, right? We want connectivity. We want a pan-Turkic trade corridor that basically can be a strategic asset. When you talk about crossroads of peace, typically what Pashinyan or one of his proxies does is take out a map with arrows going in different directions. That proposal has not really been well developed over the period of time in which it has been announced. Okay, so I kind of use both, mostly because people who are not from Armenia, who would maybe watching this this interview, they won't necessarily know what crossroads of peace is, right? I think it's important that whoever watches this understands clearly what we're talking about. But the terminology of crossroads of peace has not been widely adopted in the United States or Europe, as far as I can tell.
While Armenia's government is trying to implement the Crossroads of Peace project, Azerbaijan is threatening and demanding the so-called Zangezur corridor. What do you think? How will this issue be resolved at the end?
Right. So, in candor, at the moment, this is not going to end well for Armenia. Not unless the Pashinyan administration takes a dramatically different course of action, or there's new leadership in Armenia. And I mean like almost immediately. It is well understood that Turkey and Azerbaijan at the moment have the upper hand. It's not permanent. There's nothing that is permanent. But even the way you phrase the question, how will it resolve? You should assume that nothing resolves in your favor unless you're acting in your favor. The biggest issue that Armenia needs at the moment is a strategic partner for the Sunnic region for crossroads of peace, okay? Because there needs to be a balance of power in the region. At the moment, Armenia lacks a balance of power. They need a country, okay, that can effectively pull weight, pull rank on both Turkey and Azerbaijan, okay? What I have recommended to the Armenian government, and I've spoken publicly about it in a number of different forums, okay, is strengthening Armenia's alliance with Egypt. Well, why is this? Well, first of all, Egypt is a peer competitor to Turkey, okay? Egypt also has a very strategic relationship with Israel, which is going to be very important vis-a-vis Azerbaijan. In addition to that, Egypt has experience with large-scale logistics, i.e. the Suez Canal. And insofar as there is a land-based corridor, okay, it would be beneficial to Egypt to balance, okay, their risk with Suez with the land-based canal, meaning they're diversifying their revenue, okay? And it also brings stability effectively to Armenia by having a large partner in the region. Egypt has been taking actions that effectively push back on Azerbaijan and Turkish interests, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, there have been agreements and cooperation amongst Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt. And this is very clear why they're doing this. Okay, they're doing this to effectively push back on Turkey. Okay, so there is a maritime component to a sort of a Turkish containment strategy at the moment, but there's no land-based component to it, okay? So at the end of the day, Armenia is going to have to look to the region to build its regional alliances, which can then strengthen its hand with the United States and with the European Union.
Coming to the region, we should also see Iran's influence in the region. The fact that Iran is actually against the opening of the so-called Zangezur corridor. How do you see Iran's role here?
Iran is very important to Armenia. And I think the fact that Armenia has had positive relationships with the Iranians over millennia is going to be hugely beneficial to the Trump administration. But what I would say is this, and it's very important for your viewers to understand what took place in DC when Modi, the leader of India, was here in DC meeting with Trump, okay? One of the things that was discussed between Trump and Modi was something called the India, Middle East, European Corridor, otherwise known as IMEC, okay? That's the acronym that's used for it. So the IMEC corridor effectively skips over the middle corridor altogether, okay? It basically connects India to UAE, to Saudi Arabia, a little bit through Jordan, to Israel, and then to Greece and onward, okay? And other countries are trying to sort of hang on, but this is the major economic proposal for the entire region. As part of that, okay, the Trump administration has effectively revoked waivers that were implemented during the first Trump administration that gave relief from sanctions for the Chabahar port. Chabahar is the key port in Iran, okay, that will connect India, Iran, then to Armenia, okay? So, in other words, the Trump administration has reversed its position on the Chabahar port. Okay, it has also gone all in on the India, Middle East, European corridor, which gives no thought or consideration to Armenia and the middle corridor. That in turn weakens Iran and India. The key question right now is, where's India going to go? Because India effectively has had to pull back from its potential investments in Chabahar, given the position of the administration. And this is in turn, in part, a reflection of Trump's maximum pressure strategy on Iran. But this in turn weakens Armenia's ability to work with Iran in a meaningful way. Meaning, like, the Sunni region ultimately is going to be put to its highest economic value. If Iran and India are not part of that, because the administration at the moment has basically cut the legs from underneath that, and India says, look, there's too many roadblocks to working with Iran and Armenia and developing connectivity. I'm going to go in the direction of the India, Middle East, European corridor. Well, that basically means that Armenia is basically hampered in working with Iran and India in building that connectivity. Now, somebody in the US might say, okay, but who cares? Iran's not our ally, right? We just want to do nuclear deterrence. And at the end of the day, the case has to be made by Armenia and other countries that having a strategy for the Middle East, which excludes major countries like Iran, is in the long term not beneficial to the United States. Just like in the same way, if you have a long-term roadmap for Gaza and the Palestinians, are you going to exclude them altogether? Or is there going to be a normalization process in which they participate widely in economic security that basically gives them the ability to live and thrive, in the land in which they're situated? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're saying that the US is not that much interested in right now in the middle corridor.
Yes, at the moment, I do not think that the Trump administration has reflected a keen interest in the middle corridor, nor do I necessarily think that they understand its strategic importance. Okay, I'm talking at the most senior levels of the administration. I'm not talking about people who are sitting within the State Department, DOD, etc. But generally speaking, they've not articulated an understanding of the middle corridor, and in particular, why it's important to India. So let me just take a couple steps back. Okay, at the end of the day, the U.S. is not going to pivot because it's good for Armenia. They're going to pivot because basically it's good for the United States. The question that people in the United States have to ask themselves is the IMEC corridor, as it currently has been conceptualized and discussed within U.S. circles, is that sufficient to anchor India within the West, within a Western economic framework in which the ties and allegiances will go towards the West? I think the answer to that is clearly no, okay? Which is why India has been hedging its bets on a lot of different things. So where India goes, that's where the U.S. strategy on China goes. Because at the end of the day, if India effectively has to mediate on its own hostile interests from China, Turkey, Pakistan, etc., and the land that surrounds it, and the U.S. plays no role, well, I think the IMEC corridor will do very little long term to address that. And that in turn means that India is going to take self-protective actions that are not aligned with Western interest. They're going to be aligned with their own interest and aligned with the Russians. And that in turn basically shoves the US out of that region. Then you have to say, okay, well, if the US doesn't have a role in Central Asia, if it doesn't have a role in the South Caucasus, what is the hook for basically splitting Russian and Chinese interest in the region? Because remember, the thinking at this point is, we have to split Russian and Chinese interest. What are we going to do? Okay, well, they have no strategy effectively to effectuate that. So when you make the case to people in the US, I want to frame it in terms that are relevant to people in the US and what they think about, right? And putting Armenia in that context versus assuming that our priorities are their priorities, right? I think that's the effective part of diplomacy that the Armenian government has to do, like all the time, but it's really been lacking.
Let's come to Azerbaijan as a strategic ally of Israel in this region. In March, Trump's special envoy Witkoff visited Baku from Moscow. We don't know whether he met with President Aliyev or other officials or not, but actually Azerbaijan, being a strategic ally to Israel, has caused growing concerns in Armenia that this is going to change how the US is looking at this region.
I completely agree with you, and I think Armenians are right to be concerned, right? So I would assume that Witkoff met with Aliyev because in Moscow he met with Putin. So there's no reason he wouldn't fly into Azerbaijan. It's also my understanding that Netanyahu and his administration set up those meetings for Witkoff, okay? Again, I think that this is extremely problematic. Why is a foreign country setting up meetings for the U.S. administration in this manner? The U.S. has its own chops with Azerbaijan and doesn't need Israel to intermediate. The fact that the administration saw fit to basically have Israel set up the meetings and effectively set up the agenda. Because remember, it's not just this question of setting up the meetings. Anybody can set up meetings. The U.S. doesn't need Israel for that. Israel's setting the agenda, okay? And so the way Azerbaijan is being positioned at the moment is that Azerbaijan should participate in the Abraham Accords, which is sort of one of the key components of the overall strategy for the U.S. in the Middle East. Okay, so effectively it's elevating Azerbaijan's significance and importance in the region. Okay, so if you think about it, it's not so much that Abraham Accords is necessary for Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has worked with Israel for some period of time, right? Abraham Accords has typically been thought of in terms of Saudi Arabia or other countries that currently don't have diplomatic relations with Israel. But now they're saying Azerbaijan is a key partner within the Abraham Accord framework for the entire Middle East, right? They're trying to basically do this as a diplomatic coup effectuated by Israel for Azerbaijan that elevates its significance and importance in the region. And you really have to ask yourself, at least from, again, I'm wearing a U.S. hat now, how is this coherent? At the end of the day, Turkey and Azerbaijan have basically said one people, two states, meaning they effectively mutually support one another. Turkey is hostile to Israel. So one of the things that Armenia needs to do is effectively challenge the notion that Azerbaijan is at its core friendly to Israel or friendly to U.S. interest in the region, because there's a lot of kind of talking out of both sides of your mouth, and Turkey gets to have the benefit of posturing to the Muslim world that they're defending the Palestinians while at the same time aligning themselves closely with Azerbaijan, okay, which is facilitating effectively the demise of the Palestinian state, meaning Turkey shouldn't be able to have its cake and eat it too. This is a rampant hypocrisy that candidly the Armenian government needs to point out on a continual basis. Do I think it's concerning that there is an attempt to sort of enmesh Azerbaijan into an overall strategy in the Middle East, which Israel supports, and cementing that with the United States? Yes, I think the Armenia should very much be concerned by that. But that only highlights the point that Armenia needs to bring more strategic interest to the region, okay? Namely Egypt and India, and then, developing that even further.
Okay, and one last question. What do you think, what strategies should Armenia adopt to actually balance these regional powers?
If Armenia is strategically irrelevant in the region in which it sits, it's strategically irrelevant, okay, to the United States. Armenia will always be strategic to Russia because Armenia is effectively in Russia's backyard, right? So at the end of the day, it's not a question of whether, Armenia is strategic to Russia. It is. But, what I'd like to see is effectively that Armenians have a seat at the table and are no longer willing to accept crumbs. So, for example, let's just talk about, relations between Armenia and the EU, okay? Does anyone seriously think that Armenia is going to be a part of the EU and or EU is going to extend security guarantees to Armenia? Does anyone actually think that? Because you think that they have their hands full. They barely can figure out how they're going to have guarantees for Ukraine. They're going to have security guarantees for Armenia. Okay, even if there's a EU monitoring force, that's going to be the make or break issue for Armenia. Like at the end of the day, Armenia has to have strategic alliances that are in that region, and it's very clear where they need to look. They need to look to Greece. They need to look to Cyprus. They need to look to Egypt. These are countries effectively that are working in broader coalitions that advance Armenia's interest, okay? That's where Armenia needs to look first, okay? Versus trying to sort of say, well, am I going to be oriented towards the EU or the US? People in the US right now are not even thinking of Armenia, okay? So by all means, act strategically in the region where you are at. There are plenty of countries that want to see Armenia succeed. Let's just talk real quick, too, on some of the turmoil that's taking place in Turkey right now, okay? Because this is really important that people think this through, okay? The EU at the moment has condemned the arrest of Erdogan's opposition candidate, right? The Istanbul mayor. The US has not. The US has basically said this is an internal matter. Okay, so this is something that has to be factored into consideration by the Armenian government in terms of what their overall posture is. Okay, now you would say to yourself, okay, that means that Armenia should be more closely aligned with the EU because the EU is concerned about what's taking place in Turkey right now with the mass protest of protesters, etc. But remember that Europe is fundamentally constrained right now in terms of what it can take on. The US, in turn, basically has Turkey as a key ally, okay, but has effectively looked the other way in terms of an opposition candidate being arrested who is arguably much more democratically oriented than Erdogan. Okay, I don't think that that's a stretch. The red carpet was rolled out for the Turkish foreign minister during his visit to Washington, D.C. He was giving a talk at the Atlantic Council, Fidan, which is the same place Pashinyan spoke, with virtually no mention of what is taking place with the arrest of the Istanbul mayor at this point. This only goes to show you how well entrenched Turkish interests are at the moment in Washington, D.C. So I would make sure that the Armenian government, as well as Armenians overall, keep a very close eye on what is taking place. My biggest concern for the region overall, not just Armenia, is that effectively the U.S. government is signaling in one form or another, okay, that it has two main proxies in what I call the greater Middle East, one of which is Israel, one of which is Turkey, okay? And they will have relations with different countries on a bilateral basis, but those relations will be secondary to their overriding interests both in Turkey and in Israel. And if you think through what the U.S. is doing in the region, in Syria, for example, and other countries, they are prioritizing Turkish and Israeli interest, and then saying basically, we will give preferential access to countries which in turn have prioritized Turkey and or Israel in their foreign policy. Well, guess what? Armenia sits entirely outside of that, okay? Armenia has no relevance in a framework where Turkey and Israel are prioritized for U.S. foreign policy in the greater Middle East. This is the conundrum that fundamentally Armenia is going to have to grapple with. It's incumbent upon Armenia to do two things. Again, make the strategic case to the United States, but before doing that, making the strategic alliances in the region that it needs, because at the end of the day, these things concern many countries, not just Armenia. And if there's a maritime component to containment of Turkey, there should also be a terrestrial or a land-based component. And that's, again, what Armenia has to deal with. They have to think that through and strategize around it. And I would say, too, that it should be sold in a way that is beneficial to Russia. There is absolutely no reason at this moment for Armenia to take a hostile posture to Russia. Russia has a lot to gain from Armenia basically being a neutral country in the region facilitating. I know there's been talk about rapprochement or closer relations between Azerbaijan and Russia. I think that those are very short-lived and fundamentally that Russian interests are more aligned with Armenia's long-term than Turkey and Azerbaijan.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Arakelian, fellow the Armenian Society of Fellows.